We're in the midst of a huge transformation where our peers, communities, and workplaces are all really melding into one. Welcome to Reimagining Company Culture. My name is Christina Giuliano, she, her, and hers, and I am the Senior Partnerships Manager here at AllVoices. Today, I am very excited to welcome our next guest onto the interview series, Chris Moreland. He is the Chief Executive Officer and President of Moreland Accord, a diversity, equity, and inclusion consultancy, and adjunct professor at SMU Cox School of Business. Chris, it's nice to meet you. If you want to share a little bit for folks who are listening about yourself, including your pronouns, and when you were younger, do you remember how exactly you answered the question, what do you want to be when you grow up?
Yeah. So my pronouns are he, him, and his. And thank you so much, first of all, Christina, for even allowing me to be part of this presentation today. When I was a child growing up in Cleveland, Ohio, on what they call the wrong side of the tracks, the thing I knew for sure I wanted to be when I grew up was not on the wrong side of the tracks. I always felt as though there was a way for me to progress and do something that would allow me to live a life that I had only imagined by watching television shows and movies and reading about lives in books, things I had never experienced, but always knew that is exactly what I'd like to do and become with my life.
That's incredible. I love that. You fast forward to today, you have a ton of experience and you're teaching folks as well who are getting into the field. It's in the title of our interview series and something that a lot of people are talking about today, and it's a dynamic thing. When you think about company culture, what are qualitative and quantitative ways you think about measuring that at an organization?
Sure. Company culture is a very interesting topic because everyone talks about it, not really realizing or understanding what it's really all about. So let me define it first, and then we'll talk about qualitative as well as quantitative. Company culture, from my perspective, is exactly what leadership does. They create culture. And I'm not talking about just the CEO. I'm talking about all individuals who are in leadership roles within an organization. They are the ones who create the culture 24/7 by what they say, what they do, what they don't say, and what they don't do is all a reflection of culture. If you think about the measurements of that culture and you think about how would I measure that quantitatively, and I'll talk about it from a success perspective, is you can measure quantitative company culture by how many individuals actually are transitioning away from an organization. If you think about the turnover of an organization as a reflection of the culture, you would say high turnover means that we're missing the boat somewhere. You can also think about company culture from a quantitative way by thinking about what is it about this organization that has individuals feel as though they belong. And one measurement of that are things like engagement scores. If you think about an engagement score as an outward indication of a person's engagement within that environment, it's a quantitative way of thinking about the culture that has been formed again by the leadership. A more qualitative way of thinking about the company culture is something I call, what time do people check out? And what I mean by that is a lot of times individuals who feel loyal and inspired by a company, they won't check out. They don't necessarily stop thinking about issues and problems because it's 5 o'clock in the afternoon and they have to rush off to home. What they usually do is they take that company culture and they think about that problem all through the night. They wake up the next morning, they're in the shower, they're thinking about it. So by the time they get back to work the next day, they have an incredible solution. And they know in that culture, their solution is going to be valued. It's going to be welcomed. And people show them that. And that is why they stay. And that is why they have these incredible innovative ways of thinking about everything that's going on in the organization. Another qualitative way of thinking about culture is if you ever ask anyone, how many individuals do you know within this organization who you see outside of the organization? And what I mean by that is individuals who have friends that they've formed within the workplace, but that transitions from the workplace to more of a social connection as well. You know that culture is working because it has been set up to facilitate these relationships and connections that normally may not ever happen. It's a great question.
Absolutely. And setting up those conditions so folks feel like they are seen, heard, and understood, feel like they can do their best work and really meaningfully connect with their team members, be recognized for the work they're doing. And there's an alignment between values, what you say your culture is, and the actions that are really celebrated there too. Are there any kind of patterns you're seeing in working with clients and customers at Moreland Accord in either kind of questions they're asking you about diversity, equity, and inclusion, or the way in which folks want to engage in this work that you want to share?
Yeah, there's a couple of very common questions that get asked, I would say about 90% of the time. The first question is always, Chris, how do we know that we're making progress? How do we know that things are changing and that we're making progress? And my answer to that is it's when you start asking the right questions, right? Today, when you go into meetings and you decide to make a big decision for the company and you continue to go into that meeting, you make the final decision and no one has asked the question, what are we missing? Which perspectives are we missing? You know that you really haven't progressed. Because an insightful set of leaders understands that when they don't have the perspectives that are divergent or different than their own, then they're going to come to a conclusion based on just their experiences. Once they understand that there is a huge value in understanding perspectives that are just not in the room right now, that's one indication that you're actually making progress. Another indication of making progress was actually researched and understood by Deloitte. Deloitte put out a very extensive diversity, equity, and inclusion set of levels that organizations get to. And it's a four-step process or a four-level process. And the way that people should think about their progress is understanding which level are they at. One indication of progress to me is when people get to at least the third level. And at the third level, that's where you have what they call leader-led diversity, equity, and inclusion. It's when you stop having people like me who parachute in and start giving you education and experiences that you don't otherwise have. And that's actually being generated from within the organization. The organization that has leaders that see and value diversity, equity, and inclusion will begin to then incorporate it into everything that they're doing. They do what I call operationalize this work. And when that is done, that's when you know we're making progress.
Absolutely. You want to operationalize it across marketing, sales, people, human resources on a senior leadership
Absolutely.
level as well. And I appreciate that you brought up that kind of the importance of leaders and really managers to foster this environment as well. Walk the walk, talk the talk, really think about their processes. Who are we leaving out of the conversation? What can we do better on consistently? Auditing. Do you have advice for companies to really invest in that manager effectiveness and equip managers to have potentially vulnerable and difficult conversations, especially if they're moving from that individual contributor to manager role for the first time, navigating these situations?
Yeah, there's a couple of things that I would highly recommend that organizations think about investing time in, if nothing else, and that is this thing that I call gaining insights and understanding around the background and experiences of the individuals that are sitting right next to you. Too often, I go into organizations and they've been together. People have been together for 5 or 10 years, and they know nothing about the person who sits right next to them. They know nothing about their boss. They know nothing about their peers, and they definitely know nothing about the individuals who work for them. Building those relationships is so important to an effective work environment. You see, because people will clock out at 5 o'clock when they feel as though all they're here for is a paycheck. Because once the 5 o'clock hour hits, that's when the paycheck actually stops. And so they also stop. Individuals who are actually loyal to, inspired by, and engaged with people and organizations invest their personal discretionary time in activities and things that are going to make the organization perform better. So one of the investments that I recommend every organization does is make sure that you're building meaningful and intentional relationships across, within, and throughout the organization. As a matter of fact, I spent a little bit of time actually designing a game which actually facilitates this type of connection for one another. I call it the inclusive box. And the reason why I developed this game is because you don't even want someone like me coming into the organization facilitating that type of conversation. This should be done by the individuals who are already part of the organization, because that's where it's going to be lasting. That's where people are going to understand it's truly authentic and they're going to feel as though they can actually let down their guards a little bit, be a little more vulnerable, and get to know one another.
Yeah, creating again that environment for meaningful connections, really investing in this as well. You can have a great kind of goal or North Star, but you need to act on it and really set up those non negotiables. I think part of what employees and team members are looking for, you're right, is that purpose driven work being recognized and also having new or kind of engaged expectations of CEOs, senior leaders, being authentic as well, leading with empathy. Everybody has a role to play in creating more equity and fostering inclusion. What is the unique role of the CEO and really senior leaders to cultivate that equity? What does it really look like in practice from your perspective?
Yeah, it's a really, really good question. The one thing I want to, first of all, when you think about the terms DEI, we always throw them all together as though the acronym really fits together. Diversity and inclusion are pretty straightforward as far as being able to understand them. Equity is a little bit more difficult because it's got several layers to it. So I'll start with at least the first layer of equity and let you know what I have found to be a good definition for it. And that is that equity means that what you're actually doing is you're solving for inequities associated with an individual. And sometimes those inequities are simple things like, let's just make sure that we are allowing this person to work during the hours where they're going to have the greatest potential for high performing work. Other equity factors have to do with things like, this person right here is restricted to a wheelchair. And so let's make sure that we have automatic door openers at every entrance, exit, and bathroom so that they don't feel restricted to one part of our campus or one part of our organization. Those are very easy and obvious ways of understanding equity. My estimation about the role of the CEO is that the CEO has to lead. They have to lead the conversation around diversity, especially equity, as well as inclusion. You see, unlike diversity, equity is like a verb. It's an action word. You have to do something. Diversity is more about who you are. It's your being. But equity means I've got to get out and do something different. I have to solve for something. I have to solve for something that I may not have known about was actually something that was creating inequity. One example of that, if you think about even the process of just hiring an individual, there are a ton of equity issues associated with the whole interviewing and resume process. And I'm sure that most of your viewers know that if you look at just the name at the very top of the CV or resume, depending upon the name that is listed there, the likelihood that that person is going to be called is actually varied based on the familiarity of that name to the person who's actually looking at the resume, regardless of the background and experiences associated with that person. So, in my opinion, it's leadership and the CEO's job to continuously be vigilant and watching out for things like that that are occurring within the organization that can cause inequity. And when you have inequity, which what that really means is that you're missing out on the potential of individuals in the organization because you're not allowing for them to show up and be their true, full, and authentic selves. Equity is taking the asset, that individual, and eliminating the inequity, which is the liability. And if you remember high school accounting, equity, and an accounting firm will tell you an equity is an asset minus a liability. And I'm giving you the same exact definition. Equity really means an asset, in this case, the value, the full value of an individual, only being limited by the liability or an inequity associated with their being. And again, me and we are in organizations and we have this thing that I call privilege, which means that a lot of the inequities that other people are faced with, we don't realize them. But that's why we have to be vigilant, watching out for and looking for signs of inequity so that we can remove them and unveil the full value of individuals who are our assets within the organization.
Exactly. I appreciate you outlining that and providing that context as well. I think that has to do with privilege and really looking internally, asking yourselves these questions. And especially as CEO and senior leaders, you have kind of that additional responsibility and also opportunity to change systems and processes to make it more equitable for folks who are joining the organization, people who are here really actively listening, and then acting on what they share with you as well. There is a lot going on, not only in people's work lives, but also personal lives, the world at large continually. I attended a conference and they asked this question that I really appreciate in terms of how have you seen companies really successfully and intentionally, maybe not perfectly, but not perpetuate that trauma that happens externally in the world, internally at an organization.
Right, right. So, and that, so forming that into a question, Christina,
Mhm.
this is what happens a lot of times is that organizations try and solve for things that are outside of their scope of accountability, responsibility, or even ability. Here's a great example of it. There is a individual that I worked with at the last company. He's an African American young executive, and he came into the organization, and you could tell he was just not in a great mood. And even though I spoke to him to say hi, he just kind of shrugged his shoulders and walked right by me. And I said, something's going on here. I don't understand what's going on, but I got to figure it out because this guy normally is in a great mood all the time. So I catch him a little bit later in the day, and I ask him, "Hey man, is everything okay? How are you doing?" He goes, "You won't believe what happened to me today." And I said, "No, what happened?" He said, "Is just as I was coming to pull into the parking lot here of this organization, I got stopped by the police." I said, "Oh, what's going on? Why'd they stop you?" He goes, "I have no idea." I said, "Well, were you speeding?" He goes, "No." I said, "Did you run a stop sign?" He goes, "No." I said, "Do you have expired plates or anything?" He goes, "No." I said, "Well, what did the officer tell you when he stopped you?" He said, he said, "The officer asked me where was I going?" And I explained I was going into work. And he asked me, "Where do you work?" And when I told him I work right here in this building, he asked me for an ID, as though I have to show an officer proof that I am part of this organization. I said, "Man, that's horrible. I hate to, know that actually happened to you." He said, "It's not the first time." And he goes, "The frustrating thing about it is just because of the way I look, from my understanding, I get stopped a lot more often." So trauma like that happens outside of the environment cannot be solved for within an organization, within a culture. But just simply by acknowledging the fact that these types of inequities, injustices do exist in our society, does nothing more, or at least allows this person and people like that to understand that, you know what, I do have empathy for you. I do understand that there are roadblocks for you that other people just don't have to face. And I appreciate you for facing those roadblocks. And trust me, as long as you are part of this organization, we are going to try to remove as many of those roadblocks as possible. And so for an organization to think that they can operate outside of their scope of accountability, it's not going to happen. But to at least acknowledge and be empathetic and understanding of these things do happen outside of the work environment, I think is very encouraging. And I also think that's something that organizations should start doing a lot more often,
Mhm.
seeking out inequities that do exist outside of the organization to just be empathetic to it for the individuals who are faced with those roadblocks in their life outside of the organization.
Absolutely. Being empathetic, acknowledging what's happening, knowing that we do not check our identities at the door when we go into the in person or virtual office. People are bringing in these different experiences as well. I know you touched on kind of a couple of these, especially in terms of when people bunch together diversity, equity, and inclusion, and really defining what those things mean and look like. Are there any myths you hear in diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging conversations that you would like to dispel or would hope people stop talking about too?
Yeah, here's the biggest one. Number one, diversity. And a lot of times, one of the rumors around diversity is that diversity means race, ethnicity, gender, and sexual orientation. So those are like the four big categories that the word diversity usually falls into. And the reason why I'm telling you that's a myth, because there are over 1,000 categories of diversity that exist, and they exist within every single organization that I've ever come in contact with. For me, diversity is really, it falls into about three different categories. And I'm going to give you these at a very high level. There's a category that I call it's the predetermined category. There's the what I call the me determined category, and then there's the we determined category. The predetermined category are things like I was born a man and I'm going to stay a man for the rest of my life. I was born and grew to be 6 feet tall, and I'll probably pass away. I'll be 6 feet tall. I am also a black man, a black American living in this country. That's not going to change either. All of those are predetermined. Then there's the me determined. The me determined are things that have more to do with my personal preferences. For instance, I choose to groom myself the way I do. It's me determined. I choose to wear a collared shirt even on a Zoom call. That's all me determined. I could have been in a t-shirt. I choose to be in a certain field of business because I am drawn to it. All me determined, because these are things that I've chosen. So all of those things are things that I choose. I also choose, quite frankly, fish over steak because, quite frankly, I prefer the taste. All of that are me determined, but it's part of my diversity, part of my differences. And then there's the we determined. The we determined, these are things that usually come across as part of your ethnicity, where you were born, or just part of your traditions from your family. The we determined are things like, I grew up Roman Catholic. I don't think there's anything wrong with any other denomination. I like the Jewish denomination. I like what the Mormons preach. I like what the Protestants preach, what the Baptists preach, what even some of the atheists. I learned from each one of those sects. And so now I call myself spiritual versus Roman Catholic, but we determined for me at least, where my religious start to my life came from my family. I also have some we determined things like I prefer to, or based on my family anyway, our political affiliation was always very liberal and very democratic. And that's the way I grew up. And it's part of my diversity. Even though it has changed over the years, that is all part of who I am from a diversity perspective. And so if you think about diversity in those three categories, there are thousands of things that are categorically part of who we are. And that's in diversity. That is a rumor, a myth, that it only fits in four things, because it's just not true. It's just not true. I'll give you another myth around the word inclusion. I love there's a saying about diversity, is that diversity is being asked to the dance and then inclusion is being asked to dance. And there's nothing wrong with that definition. I think it's actually a very good, but also a very shallow way of understanding inclusion and belonging. Inclusion is a lot more than asking someone to dance at the dance. Inclusion is valuing the perspectives that are unlike yours. Inclusion means that I can put my personal preferences, my diversity, on the back burner and highlight yours. Highlight and learn from and value your diversity. So keeping things at the surface so that people can understand them, things like, yeah, it's race, gender, and ethnicity, right? Or, yeah, it's asking people to dance at a dance. That, to me, is a very shallow way of understanding some very deep and meaningful concepts that create incredible relationships for people across the entire country and world.
Absolutely. I think putting people or definitions in a very stringent box is almost an oxymoron to diversity, the multiple layers and complexity behind it as well, in terms of what we mean, and really defining what we mean at an organizational level, at a leadership level when we use these terms. Chris, we've talked about a lot in terms of your work experience, kind of advice you have for other companies and leaders. Is there anything that I didn't ask that you want to share with folks who are listening, or underscoring any kind of key insights that you hope people bring with them?
Yeah, there's one thing that I'm starting to learn in the more recent months of doing this work, more now than ever before, and that is that every voice counts. Every voice counts. Right before I got on this call, I was actually out this morning doing my normal morning exercise. And my morning exercise at this point consists of me getting on my bicycle and riding about 30 or 40 miles. Now, I do that just to keep my heart rate up and also to keep the fact that I love also eating. And so it kind of counterbalances all the eating. But the reason why I bring this up is because I got a phone call while I was on the bike. It was a phone call from one of my clients. And this individual is in charge of a very large organization here in Dallas, Texas. And one of the things I asked him was I wanted to bring together all of the Hispanic and African American members of this organization, and I wanted to have a separate conversation with them about their experience being part of this organization. See, it's a very large organization, but they have a very small percentage of diverse or minority, underrepresented individuals in the club. And so I wanted to find out what's their experience like. So this individual calls me up, and he happens to be a middle-aged white man. And he said, Chris, I know you're having this meeting, and I was just wondering, can I be invited? And I said, I absolutely want you to be not only invited, I want you to be front and center. He goes, are you sure that it's going to be okay that I'm part of this meeting? And my advice was, not only am I sure, I think it would send a very big signal to the rest of the organization if you are there, and also if you have a voice in the room. You see, regardless of the fact of what your background is and what your set of experiences are, your perspective is so important. And it's so easy for us to alienate ourselves, pull ourselves away from this type of work, thinking that it only applies to certain people who are underrepresented. It applies to everyone. Everyone gets better when everyone's voice is being heard. And it doesn't mean that we're going to be in agreement on every topic. But what it does mean is that the more that you talk, the more that you open your mouth, the more that you share your perspectives, the more all of us are going to learn. And ultimately, for us to move together collectively as individuals, as people coming together, as businesses, as a country, we have to figure out how to start learning from everyone's experiences and taking something away so that we can then be better informed and have a much easier journey of understanding and having empathy for another person's perspective.
Absolutely. The power of connectedness, storytelling, and really showing up, actively listening. And I appreciate you asked, kind of what my role is in this conversation too, and really creating the space so people feel like they can share their experiences as well. I think that's a great call to action to end our conversation on. Chris, thank you so much for being on Reimagining Company Culture this afternoon.
Absolutely. It's my pleasure. Thank you so much, Christina, for even having me on this conversation.
Of course, and as a reminder for folks who are listening at AllVoices, we really believe in employees being seen, heard, and understood, and know it's a requirement for the business to really succeed overall. Have a great rest of your day, everyone.